I'm Corinita with Illexotic, and this is Mental Health Monday. What's good, y'all? I'm back with another Mental Health Monday, and today we're going over about telling your story. So if you're someone who has mental health struggles, maybe prior use with substance use, been in abusive situations, just basically the difficult parts of your life, it can be used as a transformative way to make change, to heal when you tell it in a way that's empowering. So I want to share about this with y'all. So today I'm going to go over the reasons that you might want to tell your story, some drawbacks to telling your story, because there's a whole lot of awesomeness, but there's also some drawbacks, and give you some storytelling tips. So when I did training to become a peer support specialist, I learned about how to tell my story, because it's part of being a peer support specialist. The first time I told my story in a public forum was on February 28th, 2019, and that was at the MHS OAC Mental Health Oversight and Accountability Commission. And they, just so you know, are the ones who decide what to do with the money that is coming from the MHSA bill, Mental Health Services Act. In this bill, they tax millionaires in California 1%, and that money goes to mental health services, especially innovative and new ideas about mental health services. Telling my story here was pretty big because I knew it could have an impact on the way that people think about those who are like me, who hear voices, people with mental health struggles, and kind of just tell them what worked and what didn't. And so I made sure to highlight in my story about how I was unable to receive services as a kid and was kind of just passed along by the school system. And my one trip to the mental health hospital, which was horrible, it was useless, and it cost me $1,000 for absolutely nothing besides sitting in a room for 6 hours, locked in like a waiting room for 6 hours after they had taken my clothes and just given me like a little pajama outfit. So yeah, it was a very expensive trip to a waiting room. I told him about how when therapy didn't work for me, hearing voices groups worked for me, how peer support worked for me, how music has been a big factor in my wellness, and how there are so many programs available for kids already that provide like therapeutic beat making that we should be investing in for our youth. And yeah, just basically bringing home the fact that peer support is what worked for me, and not medication or being locked up and treated like a criminal. So the point of telling my story that day was I just wanted them to know about all this when they're thinking about how will we help patients that have extreme mental illness, because I'm pretty sure I would qualify under there. And what someone like me looks like when I've been given the chance at recovery and support and love from a community. So I really enjoyed telling my story. It was really empowering, and ever since I've just been telling my story over and over again. I've told my story to a class of future therapists. I've told my story at a conference for occupational therapists. I've told my story at peer conferences. I've told my story to a program with new hires that is supposed to be first responders to mental health calls instead of the police. I've told my story to other peers to inspire. So even though I only have one story, there's only one me, I've told it on many different stages to many different people and tailored it in many different ways. And so that's just my story of telling my story. So reasons that you might want to tell your story. So maybe you have a really unique experience and you think people need to know about it, but you're not sure why. So one thing you can do is you can use your story to advocate for change. If you've been through the mental health system, or honestly one of many of the systems in our country that just isn't really working, once you learn how to tell your story in an effective way, you can find different meetings, different conferences, different people that you can tell your story to, and they will listen. And I find that this is a great way to advocate. You can use your story to empower others. If you've been through something difficult, 9.999 times out of 10, you're not the only one who has been through that. If you are a storyteller, you like to share about yourself, even the difficult things, if you just get up on YouTube and make a video and share it to the world, you never know who might see that video and might be inspired to grow because of you. You could put your story on TikTok, you could tell your story at conferences, you can put your story on Twitter, Facebook. There are so many public platforms that you can reach people who have been through things similar to you. And it can really cause a change in someone's life if they connect with it and feel like it's inspiring and can help them to grow. Another reason that you might want to tell your story is because it's extremely healing. It's empowering to be able to go back and go over these things that happened to you that maybe at the time you were not in control of, but now you have control. You have the control of retelling this story, controlling the narrative, and celebrating that you got through it. The first time I told my story, I noticed immediately that there were some drawbacks. Even though it is empowering to tell your story, it's also a lot of emotion to come out. Specifically, if the events that you're telling about have caused any sort of PTSD, or maybe have some things that you're maybe not done processing, it can be really difficult to tell these stories. So that's one thing, is it can be emotionally draining. I would just make sure you plan out that you have some time to yourself afterwards. Make sure you have food and water, and you're upkeeping all your little sim needs and stuff. If you're not used to telling your story, I would definitely first start in environments that you know will be mostly supportive. There are some situations where people are not going to be happy that you are owning your own narrative. So that's another drawback, is that it can open you up for criticism. For me specifically, part of my story is I didn't want to take medication, and everyone wanted me to take medication because hearing voices is like not normal, and it's detrimental to my health or something. I'm not really sure. And for me, I see it as spiritual and a cultural thing. So I would like to learn how to navigate the world without having to take medication, because medication can completely change the way your brain works. And not only your brain, but your body, and affect, you getting diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, tardive dyskinesia, all sorts of things that I wouldn't have to deal with if I just learn how to get along with my voices. Of course, this is not the way that a lot of people are used to the story going, and it's pretty uncomfortable when you're confronted with someone who's doing things different than a doctor might tell you to do. So I've had people come up to me and tell me about their family member who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia and stuff, and they need their medications. And I'm like, that's cool for them. I didn't really bring that up. Like, you brought that up, and that's none of my business, honestly. But people get pretty upset when they hear my experience if it's different from what they've experienced. I've read feedback, someone, just being kind of upset that I came to talk to their class, saying that it was a waste of time for them. I've had some sideways remarks about my choices in life with my profession, as far as being a musician and other things. And it's fine. I have thick skin when it comes to that, because I'm really confident in my choices. And I want to share my choices because I feel like, the usual route of taking medication and going to a hospital when you're feeling unwell and agreeing that you won't be able to work full time or like have much financial independence and all these other things that come along with a schizophrenia diagnosis, that's just the way it is. And I don't want that for myself. So I've tried to fight against it really, really hard. And I'm doing all right now. And so I'm pretty confident in my choices, but that can make others feel uncomfortable. And I have to realize at the end of the day that that's not about me and my choices. That's about them and their perception, and me challenging their perception. So like I said, opens me up for criticism. that's fine with me. But understand, if you decide to start telling your story in different spaces, you're going to get different reactions than just support. Lastly, you can risk having stigma cast upon you. If you meet me in everyday life, so I guess some people probably wonder like why I leave functions early, or why I'm kind of quiet sometimes, or, you know, my attendance to things can be spotty now and then. But overall, people would not think that I hear voices. And that's fine. People have a preconceived notion of what someone like me should look like or act like. But when I tell about everything that I've been through, then I think people will get a different perspective of who I am. And all of the stigma that they have, they're going to be casting that on me. So maybe it might not matter amongst my peers. They might actually probably respect me more because they feel like they understand me more or feel like they can relate to me. But if a prospective employer that I'd like to work with who is not a peer is there in the audience, they might be like, oh no, we cannot hire her. She hears voices. Or if you have prior drug use and people didn't know that, and you tell people that you've used these drugs and been through some really difficult times, but now, like here you are now, you know, there might be stigma against you. And you kind of just got to be okay with that, because you can't really control the way others are going to perceive you. I hope that my story is helping to break that stigma and end that stigma, and people can have a different idea of what someone who hears voices looks like, is capable of. But I'm not really in control of the way that they perceive me. I can only tell my story and my narrative, but I can't change the way that they perceive me. So there's a lot of different ways to tell your story. I like public speaking. I think that's kind of weird. I don't think people usually like public speaking. So, you know, maybe you like to paint, maybe you like to write poetry, you can do art, write music, write lyrics. Of course, there is public speaking like me. I really enjoy public speaking. To me, it's easy. I like commanding the room. I like feeling like I'm in control. No one can stand up and be like, that's BS. They'll get like thrown out of whatever we're at. Like that would be hella rude. So you gotta just sit there and listen to me. And I think that's super cool and powerful. But some others might be really nervous about that. Another way to tell your story might be through writing, whether that be writing blogs, journalism. If you go to school and decide you want to write like an academic paper about something you know about and search for research that supports your experience, those are all really awesome ways to empower yourself and tell your stories. Now I'm going to give you some storytelling tips. So first off, you should focus on the positive and focus on the why. And I'm not saying that your story should be changed and coated in rainbows and sugar, but what I am saying is, like, I went through some shit, but I don't stand up on a stage and just like talk about it until I'm like deeper and deeper into this depressing hole, and the whole audience is like, damn, why are we here? I want to cry right now. Like, there's kind of an ebb and flow to telling your story. And, you know, sometimes it does get heavy, but then it's a good idea to kind of bring it back and remind people that, like, you went through difficult things, but you're powerful because you got through those things. And just the best way to focus on keeping it positive while staying like real is just focusing on the why. Why am I here telling you this story? That's the first thing I ask whenever someone asks me to tell my story at a meeting or a conference. Something is like, who is my audience? Why am I telling the story? What is the point of me telling my story? I'm not telling my story to have a pity party. I'm telling my story to either empower others, to enact change, to encourage others to see people like me differently in a more positive light. So yeah, focus on the why. My second storytelling tip is to be concise. This can be really hard, especially when you're talking about really deep emotions, because sometimes I notice when I'm triggered, I will just start talking and talking and talking and talking deeper and deeper about this thing that's like, what are we talking about anymore? Because once again, we just feel miserable. You don't have to tell all the details, all of the gruesome, hairy, gory details of what happened. I'm sure that some of the viewers have been through some difficult things. I've been through difficult things. There are a lot of parts of my story that I will never tell. And that's okay, because I want to be concise. I want to tell like the highlights of what happened that most relate to the why, like I said. So yeah, cut out parts of the story that aren't important. And that leads me to number 3, practice. Practice telling your story. You can practice telling your story to someone else. You can practice it by yourself. Write it down a few different ways, and just practice your delivery. What is really important in your story? What can you maybe leave out? When I went to the peer training, we did this really great exercise. So each of us told our story. We had 15 minutes to tell our story, and they'd have like 2 or 3 stories at the beginning of class every day. This was like a 9-month program. So after we had all told our stories, we did this exercise where then we had 5 minutes to tell our story with a partner, and 5 minutes start. Tell our story, tell our story. Then we had 3 minutes to tell our story, tell our story, tell our story. Then we had 2 minutes, and then 1 minute, and then I think even 30 seconds. If you do that exercise with your story, you will figure out what is important and what is actually just a detail you don't need. Because you will cut out what is not important when you're telling your story in 1 minute, when you're telling your story in 30 seconds, in 5 minutes, or in 3 minutes. I really enjoyed that exercise. I think it's a great exercise to learn what is important in your story. Tip number 4, don't be afraid to get in your emotions. When I tell my story, there's a pretty good chance I might cry. And that's okay. I don't get embarrassed. You know what? I let everybody see me cry, because then they know this was 10, 15 years ago and I'm still crying. This was difficult. This was difficult for me, and it still is difficult for me. And a lot of the times I look around the room and I see other people crying. And that's when I know that my story is really hitting, that people are connecting with it. And that is where you start to change people's minds, change people's perspectives, and change people's hearts. If you are telling your story and, you get a little misty-eyed, don't even sweat it. If you start like breaking down, bawling, that's never happened to me. You might want to like, draw it in a little, take a few breaths, and you definitely should practice beforehand, because if you can't get through your story without breaking down, bawling, that's probably not good. You don't want to be like totally like triggered and dysregulated and whatnot up on a stage in front of hella people. That sounds traumatic as hell. But a little bit of crying is not going to hurt you. A little bit of crying, a little tears is not going to make your audience be like, oh, look at her up there. She's crying. Wow, what a loser. Like that. If they are, that is an absolutely terrible person. Your audience is going to connect with you if you really let a little of your emotions show through. And it's okay. Just know that your audience is likely going to be more supportive than unsupportive. And people are really going to care about what you have to say if they see you being emotional about it, because they can tell that you really care about what you're talking about. It's okay to cry. Number 5 is own it. Own your story. It is your story. You can tell it how you know it. That is okay. If there are people in your past who treated you bad and it really impacted the trajectory of your life, and you mention it and you're afraid someone's gonna get upset, they shouldn't have been assholes to you. Like, they should have treated you better if they wanted to be told in your story as a nice person. There are so many nice people in my story. There is the people at the Hearing Voices group. There's the lady at the Family Education Resource Center. There's the people at mental health advocates. There are so many nice people in my story, and they don't have to worry about what I tell in my story because they treated me with respect and love. So don't ever feel bad for telling it how it is. And don't feel like just because you took a different route in your recovery, in your wellness, you rely, like for me, I rely on peer services. I don't rely on medication. I don't rely on a psychiatrist. And that's okay. That's my choice. And it's working all right for me. And like I said, I got to own that. And I don't worry about if I offend anybody, because that is me. That's my truth. I'm not going to change my story to tell a lie and say, oh yeah, I'm on, 3 medications and whatever. Like, no, that's clearly a lie. If you're on medication, by the way, whatever works for you. I'm not against other people choosing to take medication. It's just something that people have come at me for. So that's the only reason I mention it so much. But yeah, own your truth. It's your story. You went through it. It's a lot to go through. And you are allowed to use your story to enact change, to inspire others. And you're allowed to own your narrative in order to find healing for yourself. That is awesome. I love telling my story. I'll tell my story to anyone who will listen. I'll tell my story on BART. I'll tell my story on the street corner. I don't care. No, I'm just kidding. Really, mostly in formal settings. But yeah. So yeah, today we went over telling your story. We talked about reasons to tell your story, drawbacks to telling your story, and storytelling tips. I hope I've inspired y'all to kind of think about maybe telling your story a little more. It's important. If you saw my last video talking about like media representation, a lot of media representation for mental health is kind of caca-doo-doo. And I would like to see some empowering stuff out there that's more realistic than girl dissociates and murders people. You know what I'm saying? That'd be pretty freaking cool. So yeah. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've told your story in spaces that have been healing or empowering or helpful. If you've done advocacy using your story, let me know down in the comments. Even if you've written a blog post, give me a link. I'd love to read it or news story, whatever. Until next time, love you.